excited to have Grace Chiang on our Charlene's talk show today. This is our first ever English talk show. It's awesome, and I'm so glad to have you here. We have had so many great conversations, and I know you have done amazing things over the past few years. So, you told me that you have worked with now over thousands of teens already for over the past decade, right? The number is a lot. And just tell me more, about why education and teen are so important to you.
Yeah, well, first off, thanks for having me on your show, Charlene. It's great to be here. Teens. I definitely didn't start out thinking I'm going to work with teens forever, but over the last decade, I definitely have worked with teens in various capacities. I've taught, I've coached, I've been summer counselors at really famous summer camps. I've run programs for high schoolers. And just in that process, I got to witness the repeat of this story, right? Where, the teenage years are hard, the parents don't understand them. And now my startup also focuses on working with parents with teens. So I'm still very much involved in that. It really takes me back to my own teenage years where I really struggled with being a teenager, right? I really struggled with my mental health, and I was told, well, it's because you're a teenager, that's how you're supposed to feel. And I think every time I work with a teen, I try to empathize, right? Like of how hard that time is. It's a really awkward time. And so I actually also spent my master's in education studying adolescent emotional development. So it's basically my whole life now.
Tell us more about your teenage years. I saw that you have wrote a piece on New York Times just talking about how you were overachieving on so many aspects, getting all the perfect scores, but you weren't that happy. Like, tell us what happened.
So, essentially what happened is a really common story, right? I'm from an immigrant family. Mental health was not a real issue. At most, it was somebody else's issue. I grew up with parents who had a lot of childhood traumas, and they didn't know about it at all and didn't know that impacts the way they parent. And so I grew up a perfectionist, like a really, really insecure perfectionist, where literally I would not try something if I didn't think I could do it really well. I would never try a sport because I was embarrassed of learning anything. And so how that looked to everybody else was like perfect, right? You have like perfect SAT scores, AP scores, the whole gamut of things. And yeah, I felt suicidal a lot. I was really depressed. I had anxiety, and I know these words now. But I didn't then. And so I think I just kind of expected that this is how life feels, and it felt like a forever thing. And so I think I just constantly worried that it'll never be enough. Nothing will ever be enough. I'll never feel happy and satisfied and just enough, period.
What changed? Like, how did you get over that? Assuming you are currently over that, and yeah, what happened afterwards?
Yeah, it's definitely a process. I wouldn't say I'm over it. There's still moments where I'm like, oof, right? And then I replay what I said again and again in my head, and I'm like, well, was that awkward? Is my hair in my face, right? But what changed was I was so unhappy, but I had already reached the top of my childhood grand plan, right? Like when I was in middle school, I said, look, I'm gonna go to a good college, I'm gonna go to a good job, and I'm gonna get sponsored to go to business school, and then I'm gonna make it to partner at some firm, and then the perfect storybook, very linear life. And then I did that, and I got to McKinsey, and I was still so woefully unhappy, right? I was like, is this really all there is? Why am I still not happy? And then I felt guilt, right? Like I already have what so many people want, and I still feel unhappy. And I started to really reflect on the fact that I had been like repeatedly unhappy, right? And then it was actually in late college that I really started to untangle all of these patterns. I actually saw a therapist for the first time in freshman year because a friend had committed suicide.
Wow.
A friend at Yale had committed suicide. So we were all asked to go see a therapist just to check in, right? But that was my first time ever seeing a therapist. My dean had to force me to go. And I'm so thankful she did, right? Because it basically demystified the experience for me that it's not scary. They're pretty friendly. And actually they talk about some interesting things. So they sort of pointed me in directions, but it was a really slow like uptick, right? Where I was like learning about wellness as a topic. I learned about yoga and why that was interesting. I learned about meditation. So I learned about all these things. And then eventually I tried them, didn't love them, but I would like try them a couple of times. And it was in probably late sophomore year, junior year, when I was interning at McKinsey, actually, where I was just like in a real low. I took up all of those practices. I started journaling, I started meditating, I started all of that in earnest. And I think it really, really changed when one time when I went home on one of the holidays, family cycles repeat, right? So a similar situation, a triggering situation was happening. And I just felt myself kind of step away from that situation emotionally, and was like, and I took a deep breath and I was able to settle myself. And I was like, oh my gosh, it works. Right. And that was when
And that is 3 years after your first therapy? Like how long does it take? 3 years.
That was two full years after the first time I saw a therapist. And then I went back to a therapist. I didn't see one like throughout that time. It was a lot of learning and like intellectual learning, right? Not experiential. And then that was the moment where I felt it, where I was like, I get it now. I get why this is important, and I get how this could feel if I were more serious about my practice. And then I was very serious about my practice all throughout senior year. And then when I went off to work at McKinsey full time, I try to keep these practices in my life. And I had the help of therapists along the way at different episodes in life.
And you talked about those intellectual learnings. What are they?
Yeah, so intellectually, you can read a ton of books, right? You can read books, you can read blogs, you can understand concepts like mindfulness and like attachment theory. And so I took some psychology courses. I read like the book called The How of Happiness, right? It's a very famous book about happiness. And they all made sense to me, right? And Yale has a very famous course on just
the well-being course. Yes, right. I was going to mention that.
Right. And so it's just like, I audited that course. And so it's like, I understood all the topics. And at some level it was interesting, right? I learned things like depression can be partially genetic. I'm like, okay, that is really interesting. My family does have a history of depression. And that just helped me better understand myself along the way. But I think the biggest difference is once you have that aha moment, the experiential moment is when you become a real believer, right? It's like the difference between people who are studying religious texts and actually religious. They're not the same.
Yeah. So you talked about the moment, right? Were you with your family during that time? Like when you really felt it?
Yes, I was in the car with my family, and I can't remember what was happening, but it was an emotionally triggering moment, and I was able to step above it. Yeah.
How did you first share like the therapy with your parents, right? Because I feel like a lot of family are really, taboo, like, "Ooh, this is like not true," and don't talk about therapy because like it will have bad record. Like, how do you have that conversation with your parents or your family?
Slowly. It took me multiple tries before it even really registered. So I mentioned it to my mother and my father separately. So I told my mother first. We were at home in Taiwan. She and my brother had gotten in a fight, and I wanted to share a concept with her that I had learned in therapy, boundaries. And I didn't mention that I had seen a therapist, but just that I had recently learned about boundaries. And then I was trying to explain the concept to her, and then she basically was like, no, we don't have that in this culture. That's not a real thing. And then I was trying to explain, okay, well, I have to be honest, I saw a therapist. My therapist was explaining this to me. It's a real thing. It's a real concept. Yeah, there were still a lot of cultural misunderstandings around what boundaries really mean, right? Because she was like, we didn't grow up with boundaries. What you think like we didn't have to take care of our parents, etc. What kind of boundaries would that be, etc. And I tried to legitimize it by saying I saw a therapist and they told me this. It didn't work. And I think I just very slowly sprinkled it in because I kind of had opened it up to her that I had seen one, right? Then just whenever I was trying to bring up something to her, something she was learning. So at that point, she was in education. She was actually running after school in Taiwan. So she was trying to figure out how to motivate all these kids, right? And so she had started learning a little bit about learning theory, motivation theory. So then I tried to like share tidbits with her and be like, by the way, my therapist told me this, right? And my therapist told me that. I thought it was so interesting when my therapist this. And so I think I just had to normalize it for her that like, this is a person in my life. This is a real word, and it really helped. And I think over time she saw the changes I went through, and I think believed it. And she didn't acknowledge my therapy until several years later, I would say. It was probably until I was almost done with full-time McKinsey. So a few years out of school, when she was like, well, like, yeah, if it helps you, then that's great. Good for you. Right. So that's how it kind of happened with my mom. And I have to mention that at the same time, she was kind of going through her own journey. And so I think that is what eventually helped her accept all of this. My dad, on the other side, I think is really interesting. I think like most traditional Asian fathers, he was like, what are you talking about, right? I literally was sitting in a restaurant with him when I shared with him, I was like, by the way, I'm seeing a therapist. It was my senior year of college. And he was like, what? And I was like, yeah, I'm seeing a therapist. He's like, for what? Why? Are you okay? Is something wrong? And he's just like started like full out panic, right? And I'm like, no, like everything is fine. Actually, it's my third time seeing a therapist now, and I think she's great. And let me tell you things I've learned. And I think he listened, but internally was just like panicking, right? And I understood that, but I couldn't take away that panic from him, nor is it my responsibility. So kind of left it at that for quite some time. And then it wasn't until I was at McKinsey full time and I was going through another depressive episode where I told him this, and I was like, I just feel so depressed sometimes. And then he goes, are you seeing a therapist? and I was like, that's funny, you should mention that. Well, thanks for recognizing that it's real. And yes, I should now go see one. I just gave him time to process it, I think.
Yeah, it's funny because like I actually just had my very first call with my therapist today, like ever in history, and I don't know what to expect because like this is new to me, right? I did coaching, I did like mentorship, and I was just telling her that I don't know what to expect, but I want to get better at managing my relationship with my family and my fiance. And she's really helpful. She's like a friend. And I was like, oh, this is not the therapy I expected on the textbook. Yes, it's different. And I'm just really glad to have that conversation. And it took me a while to demystify as well, because I don't know what is that. Maybe in the cultural stories we tell ourselves, or some sort of old stories, like it's there and it's seated so deep that we don't know it's false.
Yeah. Well, congrats for taking that step. And I think that's what my dad had to overcome, right? He had this image that you have to be really sick, you have to be in a really bad place to really need them. I'm like, no, sometimes you just want someone to talk to. They're a professional and they can help you think through a lot of things that are otherwise quite confusing.
Yeah. And I want to take a step back because like we dived right into your amazing learnings from, the teens, the coaching, parenting, but you have such an impressive career, I have to say. So I first know Grace at Mom Taiwan. She's the founder, and I think I remember you giving a talk on college admission, like you grew up in Beito and the market, and you're telling us the story, like how do you go from there to California and then to Yale. And even at college, right? You were, I think, maybe interning at McKinsey during that period of time. After McKinsey, you came to the Silicon Valley, and then you have several roles, from investing to startups to founder, and then the second time founder, or maybe third time. Let us know. But tell us more about how did you first got started in your career?
Okay, this is going to be a little bit uninspirational, but by accident. Literally, I was a first generation student. I was out there on financial aid. I literally could not fathom jobs beyond what we traditionally know, right? Like, okay, I know like business person. I don't even know what that means now, but like lawyer, doctor, right? Policeman, these are jobs. These are physical jobs that I can understand. And so when I was in college and applying for jobs, I literally could not understand what jobs were out there to apply for. I was really lucky. So I knew I might have been interested in marketing. So I applied for every marketing job I could fine. Literally, I applied for hundreds of jobs.
Oh my God.
I had no idea what I was doing, right? But I was also really lucky that I had a good friend, a mentor, who was able to point me in the direction of consulting. He told me, he's like, I think you might actually be a really good fit. Why don't you just submit your application for these companies? And I was like, I don't even know what they do. He's like, just throw in your resume, see what happens. So the honest truth is, it's like, it was by accident. But I am very grateful because I really think it helps me kickstart my career and made me miserable enough to think about, well, what should I really be doing with my time in my life, right? This isn't it, and this is what everybody covets. Like, what should I really be doing then? And so, yeah, the steps after that were far more intentional. The steps after that, I mean, I went to grad school where I was given the luxury of exploring my own career options. And I knew I wanted to work in education. I knew that even actually as I was applying for jobs as a college student, I just didn't know how. At McKinsey, I kept trying to do education work, but I couldn't. And it was because I didn't have a degree in education. It's a pretty conservative field, kind of like medicine. We don't want people without licenses or advanced degrees. So that's the reason why I went there. But I basically went there with a few hypotheses for ways that I wanted to work in education, right? I was like, I could be an investor, I could be an operator, as in I can work in a big education company or a small startup education company. I could be an education consultant. I can go back to McKinsey and work on education. Or I can start my own thing, right? And I didn't want to start my own thing.
Wow.
And so I always thought it was going to be probably like my second or third career, probably third career, right? I always thought it was going to be my option after kids. Yeah, so it didn't occur to me that I could start now. I always felt like I didn't know enough. I didn't have enough stability. I don't even know like where I will be in 5 years. So how could I go and start a company? And so I was like, okay, I got to explore all my hypotheses. So I literally tried them all.
I love the way you solve problems. Like, just do it all.
Yeah, well, that's how I ended up with all of those, like this crazy resume of like all these things. It's like, I needed to know, like, do any of these feel better? Did any of these feel right? And none of them did. And that's why I'm starting my own company now.
Yeah, but I think there is still a little bit more, right? So what really stopped you from starting your own company? Is it really about you need to have a career in, climbing up the ranks, becoming a partner, or is there some other beliefs that held you back?
I didn't think anybody would trust me with it. I didn't think anybody would trust me with running a business. I think a lot of that comes from like imposter syndrome of where I grew up, right? I'm like, I don't know anything, right? And my relatives certainly don't know anything. So if I were to mess up, who's gonna basically clean up my mess, right? And I guess all of the examples of entrepreneurs I had seen are not like that, right? When I ask, how did you get started? I hear stories of like, yeah, I lived in my parents' basement and they fed me for 2 years. I was like, what? Right? Or like, oh yeah, I just had savings. I'm like, excuse me, how much savings did you have? Right? And you hear crazy story, or like, yeah, my parents gave me my first seed investment. And when they say seed, they mean like $1 million, right? I'm like, what? Right? I just didn't see a good path forward of like, how would you even get started without starving to death, right? And starving to death is my irrational fear. I am at no risk of starving to death, right? Like I'm sure I can make a plenty good living. Even if I went back to McKinsey, right? Like that would be a stable job. And so I had to fight that first, of this concept of like, wow, I'm going to be irrationally poor. I'm going to be unaccomplished, right? And it was just really hard to extract myself from that childhood ruler of saying like, this is what a good and successful life looks like. And I had to step away from that and redefine what success looks like for me. And so I think that was the hardest part. So that emotional journey took me years before I was like, okay, I can do this and I'm going to do this. And I'm gonna be honest, even now, like there are days when I wake up and I go, have I just made the biggest mistake? Should I go back? Right. And I'm pretty sure that's a common thing that happens for founders.
How do you define success
now? Well, my idea of success is to have the ability to generate enough, whatever it is, stability, money, resources to have the luxury of doing what I want.
Mm-hmm.
And I say it's a luxury because it really is. I understand there are some folks who have dreams that they probably can't fulfill yet, right? And I am lucky that I have a pedigree and past experience, resume, whatever, that can help me generate cash, right?
Yeah.
So I have the luxury of building things like Cherish, which I really believe in. But that to me sounds like the good life, right? Of doing work I believe in with people I enjoy, for a cause that is meaningful to me, living where I want, doing what I want. And that to me sounds like enough.
So it sounds like freedom. I mean, like having the base, but also a lot of freedom.
Yeah, the luxury of freedom. I think that like how much freedom you have is how I measure my life.
Yeah. And it sounds like you are, I mean, you still like are in a conventional path, which is you are founding your own company, but you're still doing coaching on the side, right? You're still like, tell us more, because I think that's the story we don't hear about founders.
Yes. I don't know other founders who are bootstrapping their companies by working part-time jobs. So I work 2 part-time jobs to feed myself and my dog, and to pay for Cherish, right? So it is a bootstrapped company. And so a lot of folks asked me, like, you know, why don't you raise funding, etc. Well, I have really strong beliefs about what Cherish should be like, and I am not convinced I want to raise money yet. I think there is a lot of sparkliness to raising money out here in the Bay. And I don't really subscribe to that. It's my second startup. So I feel like I got that all out of my system in my first startup. And so now, I work as a coach. I coach high schoolers on entrepreneurship. And I also coach early career folks. So like folks who are in undergrad and right out of college, to think about what careers would be meaningful and practical for them, right? Because it is definitely a balance between the two. You need to find jobs and careers that fit your life criteria, right? And so meaning, freedom is just part of that. But you need to know that those are part of your definition in order to find jobs that are fitting, right? Instead of just throwing out hundreds of applications like I did and then being like, how come I don't have a job? Or like, how come I don't like my job? So I do those types of coaching now to pay the bills.
The second group sounds like our audience a lot. So what are some patterns you saw, either mistakes or just what advice you would give them?
Yeah, I got started by focusing only on consulting. So then I pivoted to like focus on like, no, let's actually step back and figure out what is a good career for you. But I started with consulting, helping folks get into consulting. And the biggest pattern I saw there is I would start every coaching like introduction with, tell me why you want to go to consulting. And the pattern is nobody knows. Right? Like I've yet to hear a really good reason why somebody wants to go into consulting. Most of the reasons sound something like, I don't know what I want to do. It sounds like a good launch pad for the rest of my career. Then I'd ask like, okay, what is the rest of your career? Well, I haven't figured that out yet. And I always find that really disappointing because you're about to give away 2 years of your life or a minimum 2 years of your life for something you're not sure what it is, right? And the issue is then there's so many types of consulting companies, and so people just like throw their dart at like the top, right? But the top is defined by something, and if you don't understand what the definition is of a company that's at the top, how do you know it's good for you? And so the pattern there is like people don't know what they want, right? And they just kind of blindly follow rankings or what other people have told them, what society has told them, maybe what they grew up hearing, right?
That's like college admission 2.0.
Yes, exactly. And so I actually feel like there's a lot of similarity between the work I do, right? Because it's not different to step back at any point in life and ask like, what is meaningful to me? What is stopping me? And the patterns people repeat when they don't have those answers is the same. They keep shooting darts at the top.
So how do you help them unstuck? Like how do you help them get clarity?
We reflect a lot. So we journal a lot together. We reflect a lot. I have a set of prompts that I offer my students that I work with, and we go through those exercises together, right? To figure out what are your values, what is important to you, what have been the defining moments of your life, and what is that narrative going to play out in the future, and how does your career fit into that? A really good book is called Designing Your Life.
Oh yes, by the D-Lab folks.
Yes. So It's kind of like that, but guided, right? It is
Yeah.
figuring out, who are you? What do you stand for? What is your story? What are your values? What do you need in order for a successful life? And then finding the intersection of like, where does that exist
Yeah.
is how I go about doing career coaching. And even for entrepreneurship coaching, it's actually similar, right? How you as a founder have a story, have backgrounds that make you particularly fitted for certain things, right? So you have to find that, and then a market where there's demand for that. And so there's a founder fit there to be discovered. And so even with the high school students I work with, there's a lot of reflection involved.
Yeah. And through that, I believe that you already found your old stories that no longer fit. What are they?
Old stories that no longer fit. That money is my goal. You should have seen me as a kid. I really loved money as a kid. Literally anything you tell, like, Grace, can you go, pick up that backpack for me? That'd be $5, right? That was really me. I had piggy banks on piggy banks on piggy banks, right? Like I would fill them and do nothing with them. I was that kid that would hoard class money, right? I would sell origami, like folded paper cranes to classmates for paper money, right? And that was just what I was driven by as a child. It was just like, I just didn't feel safe until I was safely enveloped in money. And that was a narrative I had to abandon and no longer works for me, because the work I'm doing now, the lifestyle I have right now, clearly is not conducive to generating piles of cash, but that's no longer important to me. And I think I also had to let go of the narrative of like, if I'm not in a stable traditional job, I will be miserable, poor, and like hungry, right? And that's again back to my irrational fear of being hungry. I still have it, but I also have had to do a lot of work to help myself understand, like, I will not starve to death, right? Like I'm never going to be part of that narrative again. And so I think that was another one I had to let go of. One I'm still figuring out is like, what does it mean to be a woman in all of the spheres that I have been a part of? I think growing up, I really liked the narrative of like, I was a tomboy growing up. So I really like the narrative, like I'm like a counter feminine like woman, right? Like I want to do everything women aren't supposed to do.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I believe that now. And so I think that's another thing. I don't know if it doesn't fit me as much as like it's evolved for me. I still do a lot of atypical things, I think. Like I'm still in fields where there are very few women, but I also want some traditionally feminine things, I think, right? Like I really aspire to a family, and I think that's okay. My childhood self would have killed me if she heard me say now, like, look, I actually want to be a stay-at-home mom. I think that's a really, really controversial thing, even in my circles, right? How do you go to Yale and Stanford and McKinsey and founder, blah, 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 and then be a stay-at-home mom? And I think that is a really different narrative than the one I grew up telling myself.
You tell us about like the old stories you stopped telling yourself, and are they usually, how do you find them? Is it through mentorship? Is it through coaching? Is it just through journaling? Like how did you point them out?
I'm trying to think. I think they were different. I think especially the what does being a woman mean to me part has just been a lot of reflecting, right? And reflecting on my life, my relationships. But the other two, I think, were like came from multiple influences. Some of the courses I took in graduate school actually went a long way to helping me define what is important to me and to help me be honest with myself, right? Of what truly drives me now. I think being able to admit some of the old traumas in therapy helped me face those things and say, actually, it's okay if I don't want these things. So it's a bunch of different things that led me there. But there's one that I wouldn't call it a narrative, but one that mentors really helped me unpack is this idea of the perfectionism thing coming back, right? I worked in the past when I used to work in teams and lead teams, I was very like military, right? Like my teams ran like machines, right? And I love that. I love operational excellence. I'm like, everything must be on the second, right? And we got to hit objectives. We got to hit all the KPIs. And we did, and we surpassed them. And all the teams I led when I was younger was always like way over and beyond. But at the end of it, I had no friends, right? Like my team didn't
That's
want
a
to,
toll, yeah.
right? Like teams never want to see me again after we work together, even if it looks good, right? They're like, literally, I have heard people say like, yeah, if you want a good resume line, work with Grace. I'm like, wow, right? And mentors really helped me unpack that. There are three managers in my life that I have just literally endless respect for. I would follow them to the ends of the world, just these people. And they helped me see a really different form of competence, right? As a child, because of the things I grew up with, competence looked like perfection and looked like at any cost perfection, right? Stay up all night. I literally in high school only slept 3 hours a day, and that looked okay to me.
I don't know how you did it.
Not okay, don't do it. And so I'm just like, that brand of perfection is toxic, right? And that was the only way I knew how to work, and that's how I drove other people to work when they worked with me on teams. And these three mentors really helped me see a more gentle, compassionate, thoughtful style of leadership that still drove results like no other, right? And I really believe that now. And I think that is probably the biggest way my mentors have influenced me.
Tell us more about the style they showed you. Is it vulnerability? Like what is in it?
So I think the common thread between all three of them is that they just really care about their team. They care about people on their team, right? So they will get to know you. They will get to talk to you about your actual life, right? What are your interests? What do you do outside? What classes are you taking, right? How's that going? So on one of the conferences I worked on with one of these mentors, I had a family member pass away during the conference. And for anyone who's done any conference planning, it's chaotic during the conference, right? One person short is a disaster because there's so few people to begin with on your team. And so, I was really stressed out. So I didn't tell him. But I was just like really flustered. And then basically he pulled me aside on like the second night and was like, Grace, are you okay? And then I was like crying. I told him, and he was like, oh my gosh, go home. Here's the conference card, like go get yourself dinner and then go home, go to bed. And that was the kind of kindness I needed to see in action, right? Like even in the most stressful moment of work together, right? We planned all year for this conference. Now we're in day 2 of 4. And he's like, yeah, go home. It's okay. Right. And that really helped me see like people come first. Right. And
is that Wyman or is that McKinsey? Wyman.
It is Wyman. So yeah, that really helped. The McKinsey mentor I'm thinking of used to shield my like medical days where I would go for appointments, and that's protecting me, right? Like protecting me as a person, not because it'd be good for his team productivity. It certainly wasn't, right? Because I was out of office. But it made me feel like they care about me, and I want to work harder for them.